Welcome everybody. Thanks for jumping on today for our third quarter first responder meeting. I'm very excited to welcome two guest speakers this quarter. We have Daniel Bennett here, and then Elena Candice was going to join us today for suicide prevention in older adults. Something came up and she is not able to make it, but luckily Allison is here to fill in for her. So it should be just as informative and exciting information to have to take with us back into our professional and personal lives. So I'm very happy to welcome them. Thank you for being here today to speak to us. And as always, we'll record it, get it up on our YouTube if anyone needs to watch it later or share it. And with that, I will turn it over.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. My name is Daniel Bennett. I am the Prevention Manager for Greenleaf Family Center in Akron, and I'm also the Chair of the Summit County Suicide Prevention Coalition. I'm going to be covering today suicide prevention and firearms owners. Before we get into that, Allison and I are going to go through some statistics for suicide for Summit County and for Stark County. We have on here Summit County suicide statistics for last year for 2021. We had 93 total deaths. Of those, 77 were male and 16 were female. 81 were Caucasian, 9 African American, and then 2 Hispanic, 1 Asian. If you look at the chart on the, if you go back for a second, Courtney. The chart at the top there, you can see that primarily a lot of our suicides were in the 20 to 29 range, and then the 30 to 39 and 50 to 59. Those were our highest numbers. We had the most suicides, methods being for gunshots, followed by hanging. And then for 2022, this is through the end of August, we've had 46 total suicides, 37 male and 9 female. That puts us a little bit behind the numbers that we were at for last year. You can see our 20 to 29 range again is our highest number for an age group, and then gunshots making up a significant number of our suicides, again with hanging as the second most common. If we kind of compare this to past years between 21 and 22, the highest Summit County's ever had was 2015. We had 110 suicides. Before that, we tended to be in the 70 to 80 range. Since then, we've kind of bounced between 85 and 100, the last few years in the 90s for total number of suicides. But again, firearms, gunshots tend to be the most common method of suicide loss for Summit County.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just for some statistics on Stark County data, in 2021, we had, oops, sorry, in the wrong view. Apologize about that. We had 76 suicide deaths. As you can see, this kind of outlines the data that we have from 2002 until 2021. And so 76 was our second highest year on record. Our highest year was in 2016 with 77. And we've kind of, as Daniel said, bounced around a little bit over the past couple years. This year, we are trending a little bit further down. I'll talk about that in the next slide. Okay. 2021, again, comparison for Stark County versus national rates. And this is the rate per 100,000 people. And so you can see the national rate for 65 plus is 16.4. However, in Stark County, it was 24, so significantly higher. And same thing with 45 to 64-year-old age range. The national rates is 17.4, and Stark County is 23.39. Just a little bit more statistics for 2021. We had 64 males that died by suicide versus 12 females in 2021. Comparison to where we are currently at for 2022, we are currently at 23 deaths. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it kind of does a comparison over the past several years from August. So we are trending down, which is a great thing. So hopefully that downward trend continues through the rest of the year. As you can see, again, the 60 plus age group is on track to be the highest age group again this year, as it has been for the past couple of years as well. So definitely is an area that I know is of interest to this group and an area that we've been tracking for quite some time. So as you can see as well, firearms tend to be the highest method for Stark County residents for 2022, and that trends with all previous years as well.
Thank you, Allison. We could see both from the statistics from Stark County and from Summit County, there were some significant differences in the age ranges we saw dying, but kind of a commonality between both counties was that firearms were the most common form or the most common method for suicide loss. And as we can kind of see on this slide, it kind of outlines some reasons why. When we think about the role that guns play in suicide loss, about 80 to 85% of suicide attempts that involve a firearm are fatal. And that's significantly higher than we see with some other methods. If we think about overdose, the average number of overdoses that lead to a death for suicide are only 2%, and jumping deaths is only 35%. So significantly higher likelihood that a suicide attempt will end up in a loss if it does involve a firearm. Guns are very accessible. They have a really high fatality because of that. It's not hard to get a firearm in the US. They're pretty easy to use. Most are fairly simplistic. And if we think about how guns are represented in pop culture and TV and movies, it's almost a guide on how to use a firearm. Generally, people are familiar with them. They are designed to be deadly or at least to severely injure someone. And then once that suicide attempt has been initiated with a firearm, it can't be undone or aborted. If we think about a person maybe making a suicide attempt by trying to overdose, they may have time even after they've taken that medication or that chemical that they can call 911 or go to the hospital or access some help. But that harm that's caused by the firearm is so instantaneous that depending on where a person's shot, there might not be anything we can do in that case. So there's not that opportunity for an individual to have second thoughts there with a firearm. We also see that gun ownership tends to align pretty heavily with high-risk populations for suicide. Men are more likely to die by suicide than women, and men are more likely to own guns. And if we look at per population level, guns are more common in rural areas, and we also see that people living in rural areas are more likely to die by suicide. We do have a new campaign that's working here in the state of Ohio to address suicide loss through firearms. It's called LifeSide Ohio, and you can see the tagline there, by your side, united for life. And LifeSide is really a pretty unique opportunity here in the state of Ohio. It's actually the first time that the state has taken this approach. It's kind of a connection between the firearms community and the mental health community. And they're kind of really doing this by engaging firearms owners themselves. When we talk about prevention, we always talk about we have to engage the population that we're trying to change behavior in. And for years, firearms owners weren't involved in the conversation around suicide prevention. So this really gives them an opportunity to come into the conversation. It's completely apolitical. So the staff working on LifeSide, they don't care if somebody is pro-gun or against gun. They don't talk about bills, laws, anything like that. It's really just how can we, if we have firearms in our home, how can we reduce risk for suicide? If we're engaged working with people on firearms, how can we have honest conversations? And then it's training those firearms owners in the knowledge, the resources, so that they can have those confident conversations around suicide. LifeSide's kind of kicking off first with retailers, with the veteran and active military populations, and then connecting with first responders and police departments to spread that information around suicide prevention. So when we talk about how we do this, how do we reduce the risk for suicide when it comes to firearms? We're really talking about a term called means restriction. And we've got a definition there. Means restriction is just the act of blocking or slowing somebody access to the method they would use for a suicide attempt. It could mean that we completely stop them from accessing it. We might think about like roof access on a building. We could lock the doors, keep somebody from getting there. It could also be that we're just slowing their access down. And when we're thinking about suicide, if it's something as simple as just adding more time to the process, that's additional time for that person to have second thoughts. If they have to really kind of plan this out, it's no longer that impulsive act. And the more time we're giving them, we're also giving more opportunity for another person to step in and potentially intervene and get them help. So means restriction can be slowing that individual down. Those means restrictions can reduce our suicide rate. And there's some examples of that here. Pesticides, there are some countries in Southeast Asia and in Latin America that had really high rates of suicide involving pesticides. And the governments in some of those countries stepped in and reduced access to those pesticides, made them so that the ones that were especially lethal to humans weren't available for the general public. And as a result, they did see those suicide rates fall. In the UK, for a long time, they used coal gas to heat homes. And coal gas has a high rate of carbon monoxide as a byproduct. And they were seeing a lot of people using that coal gas to make suicide attempts and die. Since they've switched to natural gas, which has a lower output of carbon monoxide, it was an unintended consequence, but they saw their suicide rates go down because they had less access to something lethal there. And then with bridge fencing, that's a pretty common method as well. We saw that here specifically in Summit County. For years, the Y Bridge in Akron was kind of known as like a suicide hotspot. And people would, go there to make a suicide attempt. When they put the fencing up, that reduced our jumping deaths pretty significantly. And you can see the Route 8 bridge from the Y Bridge, but people didn't just switch bridges. Again, restricting that access because it was kind of a well-known suicide spot, that's made a big difference in reducing some of those concerns. It is possible too that means restriction can be harmful, and that would be if we are specifically restricting the least lethal methods. For example, like over-the-counter medications, if we were really tightly monitoring those, individuals may turn to a more lethal means to make that suicide attempt. So there is some concern there that lethal means restriction might not be appropriate for all methods that an individual may consider for suicide. And then that last piece at the bottom, the term means restriction itself can be a little bit controversial, especially if we're working with firearms owners. That term restriction may make them feel like we're trying to take away rights. So what we may try to use instead when we talk to firearms owners is either lethal means safety or lethal means access. And those terms tend to be a little bit less threatening. Some ways that we can store safely. For medications, we think about like lock boxes, proper disposal. We have the deterra bags that are available in our communities. We also know that there's the drug take-back days or the medication drop boxes that we see at police departments. And then prescribing and dosing regulations. If a medication is known to potentially be lethal in an extreme dose, maybe we don't have a prescription for 3 months for an individual. Maybe we only have a prescription for 2 weeks. So that dosaging can impact it. For firearms specifically, lock boxes are really common. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got a biometric lock there. That's a really common one for handguns. If an individual has a gun for protection, they can access that firearm very quickly in like a second using this box. But if somebody breaks in their house, or if they've got a kid or a family member who's maybe in crisis, they won't be able to access it. So again, it's going to stop or slow down that time there. Individual firearm locks, the top corner, we've got an example of one of those. That's called a trigger lock. Goes right over the trigger so that firearm can't be fired. There's also cable locks that may run through the action of a firearm to slow or to stop a person from being able to load it to fire it. Again, a person could drill out or cut this lock off, but that's additional time and planning and steps that they have to take that we can slow them down and potentially have second thoughts there. They do recommend storing firearms and ammunition separately. That one, especially if an individual is considering a firearm for protection or safety, they may not feel as comfortable with that, but it certainly is a recommendation that can help. And then storing firearms unloaded individually. We can see an example here in the bottom right corner of a gun safe, and an individual could store their firearms in there. We would also recommend having individual locks on those firearms while they're in that safe. It's all about adding time to that process for someone to access that firearm. There are options for temporary storage. Someone could, if there's a crisis in their home, they could ask a friend or a relative to store that firearm for them. There are some options in communities to have police departments store those firearms. I can tell you sometimes firearms owners don't feel comfortable with that process. There's not always clear-cut guidelines of how to get that firearm back or what the time process is. And they may be worried that they're just not going to get the firearm. And then for the police department, sometimes there's issues of responsibility there, or, how do I know that this person is safe enough now to have that firearm back? So they may feel uncomfortable, again, returning a firearm, and maybe for good reason. And then sometimes you can store firearms offsite at gun lockers. It might be a hunting club or a shooting range that offers those. Sometimes gun shops have those available for free or rent as well. For jumping deaths, we mentioned like fences and netting. Training for retailers for other options. That's a really interesting one. In the state of Ohio, to purchase a firearm, I can go into a gun shop. They can run a background check on me. It may take 20 minutes to maybe a couple hours, depending on the weight. And I can walk out with a firearm that day. But any firearms retailer, for any reason, can refuse to sell a gun to anyone. Even if you pass a background check, if they just feel uncomfortable in that situation, they can say, hey, you're showing some warning signs or something just seems off. Or they can even say, the system's down, I can't run a background check right now, and they can just refuse to sell you a firearm. So we've got the opportunity there to educate firearms retailers on things like warning signs for suicide, how to tell if somebody's in crisis, get them through gatekeeper trainings so that when they see those warnings, they can take those seriously and they can refuse those sales to people who potentially are in crisis. If you're going to have a conversation with a firearms owner, either you're worried that they may be suicidal themselves, or we just want to have a conversation about safe storage, there's some tips here on how to initiate that conversation. Keep in mind when we talk to firearms owners that safety is everyone's goal. Many firearms owners, whether they hunt or they shoot in competitions or they own firearms for safety or for protection, they've gone through some sort of safety class or discussion. Hunter's education class, concealed carry class, something like that. So safety is really a big piece of gun ownership culture. And when we're having these conversations, we want to make sure that we're kind of clear on what our goal is and that safety is the goal in this situation, to protect that firearms owner, their family, and their friends. Offer those alternatives. If you're talking about safe storage and a person says, well, I need access to this firearm in case somebody breaks in my house, talk about those biometric locks. Talk about how quickly we can access a firearm in case of an emergency. And then remember to meet them where they're at. We know that some people who are in crisis, maybe they will come into a doctor's office or they'll come and talk to a counselor. They may show up at a police station, but a lot of times they don't. So go and have those conversations where we're going to meet firearms owners, ranges, gun shops, local gun shows, where we can have those conversations. It's also kind of their home turf too, so they feel a little bit more comfortable engaging in that setting. Make sure the message is appropriate culturally. A good example of this would be there are parts of Ohio that they're economically depressed. Gun safes can be very expensive, so I wouldn't necessarily go into a community that's lower income and talk about storing in a gun safe, because that could be entry level, maybe like a couple $100 up to thousands. Where a gun lock, you can get those for free a lot of times through police departments or from a retailer, maybe a couple bucks, maybe as much as 10 would be kind of the max there in a lot of cases. So make sure that when we're having that conversation, we kind of understand why they own firearms, what their best option is, because safe storage can look different for different people. And then have those allies connect with those gun shops, connect with retailers, groups like Ducks Unlimited or Pheasants Forever, hunting clubs. Those are where we're going to find people that, again, are safety focused and can help us kind of be cultural brokers and get that message out. Some approaches to take to have those conversations. Sometimes an individual, I know a lot of us on this call probably, we have a lot of empathy, we care about other people, want to make sure that people are safe. Some people may be a little bit more self-centered and they only care about protecting their own personal rights. And you may have a conversation with the individual and say, well, if this firearm's stolen or it's used in a suicide or a crime, we're going to lose that firearm. So you're going to get your rights stripped from you if you don't store things safely, if we don't take those precautions. Talking about crisis. Again, a lot of people go through those trainings, and it's pretty common to hear maybe a firearms owner say, well, my kid went through a safety training. They've been through hunter's ed. They know how to handle a firearm safely. Well, that's when we're not in crisis. And if we've learned how to handle a firearm safely, then we've also learned how to handle that firearm in a non-safe way. So it's really important to let them know in that crisis situation, that training is going to go out the door. And we want to make sure that firearm's not accessible to that high school student who's struggling and, extremely impulsive in that moment. Talking about safety is always, our number one issue there, our number one concern. Some kind of things to avoid, and if they do come up, kind of how to work around it. Like we mentioned, a lot of people own firearms for protection. If they're worried that they can't access that firearm quickly enough, being able to have that conversation about the biometric locks and how we can get a hold of something, very quickly if it is a crisis situation where a person's life feels threatened. They may be worried about losing their rights. They're worried about being deemed unfit. They don't have their firearms taken away. A lot of that's just education on what treatment for depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, those kind of things actually look like, and how a person can get treatment and, continue on their normal productive life. It's not if somebody's experiencing depression that they're going to have that firearm taken away. And that slippery slope argument that we always hear. Some people will hear you talking about restricting access or locking things up and just immediately assume that it's steps towards taking away their rights. Make sure our motives are clear. We're always focused on preventing suicide, saving lives. We're not trying to take anyone's firearms away. If we're going to engage with firearms owners, we have to make it clear to them that it's not an attempt to take away any rights there. And then connect with partners and resources. The Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation, they're the ones who are kind of the backer for LifeSide Ohio right now. They're a great resource to get information. Buckeye Firearms, their website does have suicide prevention information on it. It's a little bit difficult to find at first. It's kind of buried, but that is there and available. Again, those local dealerships, shops, places that firearms owners are going to get suicide prevention information into those shops. And LifeSide Ohio is working on doing that. Our drug and mental health boards, our coalitions, anybody serving veteran groups, police unions. The last one on there, Safer Homes, that's a coalition that's out of Washington State. It was actually created by a woman who lost her son to suicide with a firearm and the shop that sold him the firearm. She reached out to them after his death and explained what happened, and they created this coalition together to address firearm loss with suicide. But if you go on their website, they have a lot of great resources, infographics, things that you can print out, little short videos that are available that anybody can use when they're working with the firearms community around suicide prevention. Hey, Courtney, do you want to save the video for later? I want to make sure that we have enough time for the other part.
Yeah, that sounds good. We can save it for the end.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. And again, I'm not Elena. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here, but I am Allison Esber. I'm the Systems Initiative Manager at Stark County Mental Health and Addiction Recovery. I supervise Elena. I used to do a lot of the suicide prevention work, leading our suicide prevention coalition before Elena came on board. And she's been doing a great job with that the past 4 years. So filling in for her today. And I'll be talking a little bit more about suicide prevention in general, but more specifically about older adults, since obviously Direction Home, that's a population that you all are serving. So some of the objectives today is to learn the prevalence of older adult suicides in Stark County, which we already kind of went over, identify warning signs and risk factors for suicide, learn how to ask about suicidal thoughts, and identify local resources in the community. Again, a lot of the conversations around suicide can be very heavy, so please be mindful of that and take care of yourself throughout this presentation and throughout the day, over the weekend as well, if you need to take a step out or anything like that. So when we talk, and I think Daniel, when he spoke as well, you'll notice we speak very differently about suicide than you may typically hear. And so we'll use words like die by suicide instead of commit or complete suicide. And that is really to change the language of suicide. And as an attempt to solve a problem of intense emotional pain with impaired problem-solving skills. And so again, when we talk about people who die by suicide, we don't want to, we're very cautious of the language that we use. Language and words have power. We know that when we talk about people committing something, it's usually a crime. And then we also don't try to avoid using the words completed or a successful attempt or a failed attempt, just because typically when you complete something, that's usually a positive check mark. You complete a test, you complete a task, and suicide is not something that we want to frame in that light. So we really try to use the words die by suicide. So next slide. All right, so some of the warning signs. These are some of the most critical warning signs that we and research has shown us to be the biggest contributing factors when someone is thinking about suicide and may make an attempt. So talking about wanting to die by suicide, talking about feeling hopeless or having no reason to live, and definitely Daniel talked a lot about lethal means, but looking for the means to kill oneself. Additional warning signs for older adults and adults in general: loss of interest in things or activities that are usually found to be enjoyable, cutting back on grooming. Isolation is a huge factor for adults, especially if older adults are choosing to self-isolate versus some of that, their families moved away or they've had friends and family that have passed or anything like that. Individuals who may break their medical regimen, so if they're going off of recommended diets, if they have diabetes or another health condition that they now are kind of throwing that by the wayside and caring less about their health, or skipping doctor's appointments. Often in the research and the data that we find is that a number of older adults will visit their medical provider more frequently than they will see any mental health or behavioral health clinician. And so if they, some of the research also shows that individuals who die by suicide oftentimes miss appointments prior to their death. And so that's definitely something to be mindful of if they're skipping those appointments and not rescheduling. Finally, feeling hopeless or worthless, definitely warning signs across the board, but especially in older adults as well. Again, putting affairs in order, giving away things and making changes in wills. This one can be a little bit more difficult with older adults just because we know that as people age, this is something that is very common to prep for. And just making sure, if you're trying to make things less burdensome for a family member or friends when you do pass. But if there's some sudden changes in that, especially if you're noticing additional warning signs with that, it's definitely would be a sign to check in. Stockpiling medication or obtaining other lethal means. Again, Daniel talked at great length about that. If they've never had a firearm before, never really expressed interest in that, but then now seems to be a greater interest in that, or other means, that may be something to be mindful of. And again, preoccupation with death or that lack of concern about personal safety of, I won't be needing any more appointments. I don't really care what happens to me. Those are some common statements that we may hear from folks who may be thinking about suicide. Older, some risk factors to be mindful of with the folks that you may be working with. Depression or another mental health condition. We know that depression is the mental illness that's most frequently affiliated with suicide. But we know that anxiety, other psychiatric disorders can also be a huge factor in someone who may attempt or die by suicide. Prior attempts is probably the #1 risk factor that we know that most people who attempt suicide don't go on to die by suicide. However, if someone does have an attempt, their risk, sorry, I want to make sure that I'm saying this, that a prior attempt increases their risk that they may die from suicide at a later point in time. So just be mindful of the folks that you're working with. If you know that they've had previous suicide attempts, even if it may not be super frequent or super recent, if it may have been, 10, 20, 15 years ago, may definitely be something to be mindful of. Comorbid general conditions, medical conditions. This is obviously a big factor with older adults. We know that medical issues can sometimes precipitate a suicide attempt or a death by suicide, especially if there is, depending on the severity of those medical conditions, if they're having to attend a number of doctor's appointments, if they may have, if it may be a terminal illness, that can oftentimes precipitate a suicide attempt as well, just knowing that they may not be able to recover from whatever medical condition that they may be experiencing. High pain and role function decline. So if someone is experiencing significant amounts of pain, whether that's due to medical conditions, just aging, whatever the cause may be, and not being able to do some of their normal activities or normal things that they may have previously done, whether that's, going for walks, working out, spending time with people, sometimes even just being able to get out of the house if they're having some problems with their legs or something like that, and they're not able to, come and go as they please, that may be a significant factor. Social dependency and isolation, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next couple slides. Family discord or losses. So unfortunately, we know with older adults that if they're losing spouses, siblings, other friends, that can definitely cause more social isolation than they may have experienced previously, and that can definitely be a factor as well. If a person has their personality is kind of inflexible, or there's some rigid coping strategies that they utilize, that can also be a factor as well. That things are never going to change. Things are always going to be this way. Nothing's ever going to get better. Those are some of the things that we may hear from folks. And again, as Daniel talked about, those access to lethal means, definitely a huge risk factor. And anytime that we are able to, as Daniel shared, space out the time or distance between those lethal means, the better it is as well. Some additional risk factors, and again, these are actually across the board for all populations, but also with older adults as well. So alcohol or substance use disorders, hopelessness, again, that physical illness, job or financial loss, that this is a huge factor in suicides that we see across the board. If they've lost a job and don't feel that they would be able to financially recover or have any financial reprieve, if they're having financial struggles, any reprieve from that. Relational, social losses. So if there's a loss of relationship, that can also, a breakup, a divorce, a death of a loved one, that can also be a huge factor, and that social support as well. So some of the reasons that we see significant suicide attempts in later life is really, there's two main ones. And so the first one is that the social problems, that belongingness. We know that as folks continue to age, their routine changes. If they had worked and now they're retired, they don't have that, when you ask someone, tell me about yourself, one of the first things that people say typically is what they do, what their job is. And so when that becomes a part of your identity and that maybe shifts later in your life, having that new sense of figuring out what that new sense of identity is, if people struggle with that, that can sometimes be a factor. So feeling like people don't belong anymore. If they were, as also, with family, if, kids are moving out, they don't have that responsibility maybe that they may have previously had. Or if, they're living on their own, they may not want to live on their own anymore, not feeling that they have anyone to talk to or anyone that they can relate to. I know, especially when the world has changed over the past, several years, anytime that those changes happen, especially technology, sometimes it may be difficult for older folks to relate to some of the people that they may be working with and may not feel that they have anyone to talk to or anything in common with folks. Perceived burdensomeness is another significant factor. We know that individuals who attempt or die by suicide oftentimes have that perceived burdensomeness. And we often say perceived just because, you know, as we think about our loved ones and family and friends, that, you know, we would much rather have someone here and have them, I guess I can only speak for myself, but I would rather have someone calling me multiple times a day, every day asking for something, or, you know, than have them not here. And so that perceived burdensomeness of, you know, I don't want to be a burden to someone. I'm constantly having to call someone else to take me to the store or to, you know, help me with my medications or my doctor's appointments. That sense of burdensomeness to others can be a huge factor in that suicide, someone thinking about suicide. But we know that social problems like belongingness are often higher predictors than perceived burdensomeness. So if we're able to create networks of people feeling like they have that place to belong and that they have those connections and aren't isolated, that can be a huge factor in reducing someone's risk of suicide. So what to do if you are concerned, if you've recognized these warning signs in someone that you're working with, a loved one, anything like that, ask the question. I know it can be very, very uncomfortable, but this is one of the best ways to reduce the risk of someone who attempting suicide. It's better to be direct with them, but again, being direct and, you know, asking someone, have you thought about suicide? Are you thinking about suicide? Can sometimes be uncomfortable. And so Elena put this together, kind of going through and starting with that less direct question and getting to the direct questions. And so some of those, do you feel tired of living? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Those are definitely less direct ways, but getting to the point of when other people have been struggling in the way that you have, they think about killing themselves. Are you feeling that way too? Those are definitely a couple different ways to do that. We do really encourage, though, to be direct with your questions, even if you start off with some of those less direct questions and move into the direct ones. But saying the words, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? Those are okay things to say. We know that talking about suicide, using suicide and asking about it is not going to put the idea in someone's head. And sometimes if you're asking in some less direct ways and saying, like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? People may say, no, I'm not thinking about hurting myself. I'm thinking about dying. And so being direct with those questions is very, very important. Additionally, with that, when you're asking sometimes less direct, we encourage folks to not say and answer the question for them. So saying things like, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? Because you're already kind of giving them you don't want them to say yes. And so you're telling them you're not thinking about it when they really may be. And so being open and asking those open-ended questions of, are you thinking about suicide? And again, those are difficult questions to ask, difficult conversations. So, I mean, I encourage people to ask those questions, and in most of my trainings that I do, I have people turn to whoever's next to them when we were doing live trainings and ask those questions. And it's uncomfortable, but it's important to ask them. So if you are asking those questions and someone does say, yes, I am thinking about killing myself, or I have thought about suicide, get more details. And so part of this is figuring out what their risk level is. And so clinicians, we do this very frequently, but this is also helpful information if you're working with someone to know, so that way when you're making that referral or making some of those connections and phone calls, the information can be very helpful. So do they have a plan? We know that individuals who have a plan for suicide are much more likely to make an attempt. And so that's why this is an important piece of these conversations. So have you thought about a way that you might kill yourself? Have you made any plans or preparations? If you've given away belongings, updated your will, tying up loose ends, asking about those access to lethal means. So if they say that, if you're asking, do you have a specific way? And they say, yes, I plan to use a firearm. The next obvious question is, do you have access to one? As Daniel talked about, we know that if someone has access to the means that they want to use, that increases their risk of attempting and dying by suicide, versus if someone says, no, I don't have a gun, but I and I don't really know how to get one. I don't know where to go. I don't have access to, to drive to get one. That can sometimes be a lower risk, but still definitely something that we want to explore more. And have you started to put a plan into action? So again, if they don't have access to whatever means that they have, but they know exactly what they're going to do or know how to go about it. So if they say, no, I don't have a gun, but I have a plan tomorrow at 8 a.m. as soon as the store opens, I'm going there. I know what type I'm getting. I know what ammunition to get, and this is where I'm going to go after that. Definitely very well thought out and definitely put someone at a much higher risk. So again, if they say yes, that they have a plan, they have means, all of that stuff. Ensure that you know what your local, what your agency policy is as far as what to do. Most places have policies as far as if it's contacting law enforcement. In Stark County, if it's calling mobile response, calling 911 or contacting your supervisor, whatever your policy is, definitely we encourage you to follow that. But generally recommendations include not leaving the person alone. If someone's expressing suicidal ideations, we do not want to leave them alone. Even if they're saying that they, especially if they're saying that they have access to whatever means they plan to use, we definitely do not want to leave them alone. We also encourage folks to call someone to do a full assessment. In Stark County, we have our mobile response unit that can come out into the community and do that full assessment. If you are not in a location that has mobile response for adults, calling your local crisis line, they would be able to advise you on what to do. Same thing with 911. They would also be able to get law enforcement or first responders to the community to be able to transport that person to a hospital where they could do that full assessment. So again, just knowing who to call based on your agency policy definitely would be a good thing to have in your pocket. So what's next? So if you know that someone that you're working with or a loved one has expressed suicidal ideations, and again, I want to stress that just because someone has suicidal ideations or suicidal thoughts, that doesn't mean that they will act on those thoughts. Suicidal thoughts can be very common, but still, if they're having those thoughts, we still want to make sure that they are working with a counselor, getting that second opinion and having some of those more in-depth conversations, because we want to foster hope and encourage people that life is worth living, and how we can do that, definitely counselors are able to help. So again, fostering hope, providing that encouragement. One thing when we are working with individuals, it can be very common to, say, well, what about this person? What about this person? What about your kids? What about your grandkids? And oftentimes people who are thinking about suicide aren't necessarily thinking about the impact of how their loved ones would feel if they weren't here. They're thinking about, oh, their life would be better if I'm not here. That burdensomeness often takes over versus the perception of that loss. And so sometimes putting that, asking those questions it may not change their opinion. So again, finding what those things are that does provide meaning and purpose in their life is important, and focusing on those things. We know that individuals who have had suicidal ideations that don't attempt, it may be their family, it may be their faith, whatever their purpose and their meaning is for a life. If you're able to work with them on that and how that can be enhanced in their life to put some of those protective factors around them is really helpful. Caring contacts. If you have concerns about someone, even if they're not expressing that they intend to die by suicide, but checking in with folks, keeping that connection, limiting that isolation is a huge factor with older adults. Check in, don't be afraid to ask them again. With our provider network, we encourage folks to ask about suicide at every point of contact, just because we know that things can change. And we also know that people may respond differently to different providers as well. So what they may say yes to me, they may say no to Elena or to Daniel or to someone else. So it's important to ask at various points of time. And join their team, be that positive and connecting person with them. So here's just some general resources. The ones in, well, Coleman Crisis Center is specific to Stark County, but 988 just launched in July of this year, but that's for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The crisis text line is, the 4 HOPE number is specific to Ohio, but you can use that wherever you are based, and it'll still get you connected to someone with that crisis line. The Trevor Project is specific for individuals who identify in the LGBTQ+ community. Military and Veterans Hotline. Again, it's the same number as the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, but it does encourage you to press 1 to speak with someone specifically with that military background. And then 911, we encourage folks to ask for a CIT officer. So crisis intervention trained officers are officers that have gone through an additional 40 hours of training that is specific to behavioral health, mental health, and substance use. And so they oftentimes are able to respond a little bit more appropriately sometimes with an individual who may be experiencing a behavioral health crisis versus someone who's not. So Stark County, we have CIT officers trained from every department. And I know this is a very common training too across other counties as well. And so here are some other county-specific information if you're working with individuals in other counties outside of Stark. So Summit County, Portage County, Medina, and Wayne County all have crisis lines that are staffed 24/7 who will be able to assist if you have questions, concerns. Sometimes even if you're just not sure what to do, if you've got, working with someone and you need to have a second opinion or, talk things through, they definitely are able to help in those regards. I think that's it. So.
All right. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you both so much. Let's open it up for questions. You can go ahead and unmute or pop it into the chat. We'll check that. In the meantime, I'm just going to navigate back to that video slide. I won't start playing it. We'll do the questions first, but I will stop talking now.
I don't have any questions, but I just thank you both for presenting very informative presentation. So thank you.
All right. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll tackle them after the video. Or if you acquire some questions during your video viewing, feel free to stick around after to talk those out. If anyone has to jump off, I'm just going to say we have Portage County coming to our faith community next month on September 23rd at noon. It's also a Zoom meeting. They're going to be talking about suicide prevention as well as mental health support for older adults. And Pastor Castelli from the chapel at Green is going to speak on supporting the mental health of congregation members that are older adults. And then our next first responder meeting is, I don't remember the date, I want to say November 19th. It's mid-November to account for Thanksgiving. And I believe we're going to be talking about living wills. So you can mark that on your calendars as well. So let's go ahead and play the video. And again, any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box.
We are firearms retailers and business owners. We're enthusiasts and hunters who enjoy the great outdoors in Ohio. I'm Eric from LEPD Firearms Range and Training Facility and a current law enforcement officer.
We shoot in professional tournaments, and many of us were professionally trained to use firearms in law enforcement and U.S. military. I'm Mark from Vance Outdoors, a veteran and retired Ohio State Trooper.
And I'm Joe, Range and Training Manager at Blackwing Shooting Center. Here's what else we have in common. We're passionate about safe.
That's why we joined an effort with the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation called Lifeside Ohio.
We've joined medical professionals, law enforcement, veterans, and everyday Ohioans like you for a crucial cause.
To prevent suicides and save lives.
We want more retailers to join us too. We can't talk about suicide and mental health quietly anymore. Too many lives are being lost in Ohio and nationally.
It will take all of us from all backgrounds and all corners of the state to address it.
Find out how you can get involved at lifesideohio.org.
Lifeside Ohio.
By your side.
United for life. United for life.
All right. I think I don't see any questions in the chat. November 18th, thanks Colleen, is the next first responder meeting. So we'll send out the reminders and everything for that. Once that starts rolling around, it'll happen sooner than you expect, I'm sure. But thank you all for coming to participate today, and to our speakers, thank you for sharing your information. Daniel just dropped his information in the chat. And if you need anything else or have any other questions to follow up as well, I can get you connected.